The wind howled across the dry fields, kicking up dust that stung John Carter's eyes. He stood on the porch of his crumbling ranch house, the weight of the bank's final notice heavy in his pocket. The land, his father's land, was dying, and so were his hopes. One more missed payment, and everything he'd ever known would be gone. But that night, as he sat at his kitchen table counting the last of his savings, $5,000, barely enough to delay the inevitable fate knocked on his door. Sarah Reynolds stood on his porch, her face streaked with tears. Her husband, Mike, a veteran who'd served 2 tours overseas, lay bedridden, his injuries worsening. The hospital bills had swallowed them whole. They were days from eviction. John stared at the cash in his hands. It was suicide. It was his last chance. And yet, before he could second-guess himself, he pressed the money into Sarah's trembling fingers. "Take it," he said, voice rough. He didn't let himself watch her leave. The next morning, the sound of roaring engines ripped him from sleep. He stumbled to the window, heart hammering. Outside, the dirt road was choked with military trucks, their headlights cutting through the dawn fog. Armed soldiers swarmed his property. John's blood ran cold. Had he just signed his own ruin? Or, somehow, had his reckless kindness summoned something far bigger than he ever imagined? The morning sun burned over the cracked earth of John's ranch, mocking him with its brightness. He slept fitfully, his mind racing with the consequences of what he'd done. That money was supposed to buy him one more month, one more chance to turn things around. Now it was gone, and with it, any hope of saving the land his family had worked for 3 generations. He dragged a hand through his graying stubble as he surveyed the dying fields. The well had run dry months ago, and the cattle were skeletal shadows of what they'd once been. Every morning began the same way now, checking the irrigation lines he knew were empty, kicking the rusted tractor that hadn't started in weeks, trying to ignore the foreclosure notice tacked to his barn door. It was on one of these hopeless morning rounds that he first saw the Reynolds family's beat-up trailer at the edge of town. Mike Reynolds sat slumped in a lawn chair outside, his leg brace glinting in the sun. John had heard the stories, how Mike had taken shrapnel in Kandahar, how the VA kept losing his paperwork. But seeing it up close was different. The man's eyes were hollow, his wife Sarah moving like a ghost between clotheslines hung with threadbare uniforms. When Sarah spotted John watching, she didn't look away in shame like he expected. She marched right up to him, her chin trembling but her voice steady. "They're cutting Mike's medication tomorrow," she said, clutching an eviction notice of her own. "The doctor says without the anti-seizure pills, he could." Her voice broke. Behind her, their little girl played in the dirt with a broken toy soldier. John felt the weight of his wallet in his back pocket. That $5,000 represented feed for the cattle, parts for the tractor, maybe even a lawyer to stall the bank. But as he looked at the veteran's shaking hands and the dark circles under Sarah's eyes, he heard his father's voice from long ago. "This land isn't just dirt and deeds, son. It's what we do with it that matters." The decision came suddenly. He didn't let himself think as he pressed the envelope into Sarah's hands. Her shocked gasp followed him all the way back to his truck. By the time he reached his empty house, the reality of what he'd done hit him like a punch to the gut. He'd just signed away his future. That night, as he lay staring at the water-stained ceiling, a strange calm settled over him. Maybe some things were more important than land. Maybe. The distant rumble of diesel engines cut through his thoughts. At first he thought it was thunder. Then the vibrations grew stronger. Headlights swept across his bedroom wall. John bolted upright as the sound of shouted orders and slamming truck doors shattered the pre-dawn quiet. John's boots crunched on the gravel as he stepped onto his porch, the cold morning air biting at his face. His hands trembled not from the chill, but from the enormity of what he'd just done. That envelope had contained every last dollar to his name, and now it was gone. The weight of his decision pressed down on him like the heavy clouds gathering overhead. Inside the dim trailer, Sarah Reynolds stared at the cash spread across her kitchen table, her calloused fingers tracing the edges of each bill. Mike sat slumped at the table, his medication bottles lined up like little soldiers ready for battle. "We can't accept this," he muttered, pushing the money away with his good hand. "That man's losing his land, Sarah." Their daughter Emma played quietly in the corner, oblivious to the tension thickening the air. Back at the ranch, John mechanically went through his morning chores, his mind replaying the look on Sarah's face when he'd handed her the money. The shock, the disbelief, the desperate hope that had flickered in her eyes before she'd quickly suppressed it. He kicked an empty feed bucket, sending it clattering across the barn. What had he been thinking? Noble gestures didn't pay the bank. The sound of an approaching engine made John look up. Sarah's beat-up pickup rolled into the yard, kicking up dust. She stepped out holding a pie, her knuckles white around the dish. "I know this doesn't come close," she said, thrusting the still-warm apple pie toward him. "But it's something." The scent of cinnamon and sugar filled the space between them, a stark contrast to the bitterness of their situations. John took the pie awkwardly, their fingers brushing for just a moment. Sarah's eyes were red-rimmed but dry. "Mike's getting his medication today," she said softly. "Because of you." Before John could respond, she turned and walked back to her truck, her shoulders squared against the world. He stood there holding the pie, watching her drive away until the dust settled back onto the road. That night John sat alone at his kitchen table, the pie half-eaten in front of him. The house creaked around him, the silence pressing in. He picked at the flaky crust, remembering how his mother used to make apple pie every Sunday after church. Another tradition lost to time. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose shutter on the barn. He dreamed of soldiers that night, not modern troops like Mike, but Civil War soldiers marching across his fields, their uniforms ragged, their faces gaunt with hunger. They marched in perfect formation until they reached his porch, where they saluted him before dissolving into the morning mist. John woke with a start, the dream lingering like smoke in his mind. Dawn painted the sky in pale pinks and oranges as John pulled on his boots. The dream had left him unsettled, but there was work to do. He stepped outside and froze. The horizon shimmered with movement. A line of military vehicles snaked down the county road, their dark shapes growing larger by the second. John's pulse hammered in his throat as the first Humvee turned into his driveway. The lead vehicle rolled to a stop just feet from where John stood, rooted to the spot. The door opened, and a tall officer in dress uniform stepped out, his insignia glinting in the rising sun. He removed his hat and held it at his side as he studied John with sharp, assessing eyes. "Mr. Carter," his voice carried the weight of command. "We need to talk about what you did for Sergeant Reynolds." The rumble of diesel engines shook the ground as John stood frozen on his porch. A dozen olive-green trucks now filled his driveway, their exhaust mixing with the morning mist. Soldiers in camouflage jumped down from the vehicles, moving with practiced efficiency as they unloaded equipment. John's mouth went dry. He'd expected debt collectors, maybe even the sheriff, but not this. The officer took another step forward, his polished boots crunching on the gravel. Up close, John could see the silver eagle insignia on his uniform, a full colonel. "Colonel James Grant," the man introduced himself, extending a hand. His grip was firm, his palm rough like a working man's. "Sergeant Reynolds was under my command in Afghanistan." John's knees nearly buckled. This was about the money. They must have thought he'd pressured Mike somehow. "Listen, Colonel, about that cash, I didn't expect anything in return." His words tumbled out in a rush. Grant held up a hand, silencing him. "At ease, Mr. Carter." A hint of a smile touched his stern features. "We're not here about the money. We're here because of what it represented." He turned toward the trucks where soldiers were already unloading lumber and tools. "When my men heard what you did for one of ours, well, let's just say the Army takes care of its own, and those who take care of them." John watched in stunned silence as soldiers swarmed his property. Some carried medical bags toward the Reynolds trailer. Others began assessing his barn's sagging roof. A team in engineering uniforms clustered around his dry well, gesturing and taking measurements. The organized chaos reminded John of an anthill kicked open, purposeful, determined. Sarah Reynolds appeared at the edge of the activity, her hands clutching her daughter's shoulders. Her eyes were wide as she took in the scene. One of the medics approached her, saying something about VA paperwork and immediate authorization. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth when the medic pointed toward an arriving ambulance where Mike was being carefully loaded on a stretcher. Colonel Grant followed John's gaze. "Sergeant Reynolds will be receiving full medical care at Walter Reed," he said matter-of-factly. "Should have happened years ago." There was steel in his voice when he added, "Certain bureaucratic obstacles have been removed." A young lieutenant approached with a clipboard. "Sir, the well crew reports an aquifer at 200 feet. We can have water flowing by sundown." Grant nodded approval before turning back to John. "We understand your irrigation system failed last spring. The Army Corps of Engineers happens to have some expertise in that area." John's legs finally gave out. He sat heavily on the porch steps, the weathered wood creaking under his weight. All he could manage was a hoarse whisper. "Why?" Grant settled beside him, the starched perfection of his uniform contrasting with John's stained work clothes. "Because men like you are why we serve, Mr. Carter. You saw a soldier in need and didn't walk away. He removed his hat, running a hand through salt and pepper hair. Funny thing about the military, we notice who stands with us, especially when it costs them something. The morning sun climbed higher, warming John's back as he watched the transformation of his ranch. Soldiers in dusty uniforms replaced fence posts. A generator hummed to life near the barn. Someone had started a massive pot of coffee brewing, the rich aroma mixing with the scent of turned earth. Down by the road, a news van pulled up, its satellite dish unfolding like some mechanical flower. A reporter spoke excitedly into a microphone while her cameraman panned across the scene. John wanted to protest. This wasn't for show, but Colonel Grant simply said, "Let them see. Maybe it'll remind people what community looks like." Sarah appeared at John's side, her face streaked with happy tears. "Mike's going to get his surgery," she breathed. "They're flying him to Bethesda today." She squeezed John's hand with surprising strength. "You did this." John shook his head, looking out at the bustling activity. "No, ma'am, I just gave some money, this." His voice caught as he watched two soldiers carefully lower a new water pump into place. "This is something else entirely." Colonel Grant stood, adjusting his uniform. "We'll be here a few days, Mr. Carter, by the time we're done." He surveyed the ranch with a critical eye. "Let's just say the bank won't recognize the place." With a crisp nod, he strode off toward a group of engineers, his voice rising with clear commands. John sat there for a long moment, the morning sun warm on his face, the sounds of rebuilding all around him. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope. The next 72 hours blurred together in a whirlwind of activity. John moved through it all in a daze, watching as soldiers transformed his dying ranch into something unrecognizable. By dawn on the first day, the well crew struck water, a deep, cold aquifer that sent up a geyser of celebration. The engineers whooped as clear water gushed into the parched earth, and John stood there with his hands in his pockets, blinking back something in his eyes that wasn't dust. Colonel Grant worked alongside his men, his sleeves rolled up, his forehead glistening with sweat as he helped reinforce the barn's rotting beams. He didn't give orders from the sidelines. He hauled lumber, hammered nails, and even took a turn digging trenches for the new irrigation lines. At one point, John caught him kneeling beside the collapsed section of fence, running his fingers over the brittle wood. "This isn't just about charity, Mr. Carter," Grant said without looking up. "It's about respect." By the second day, the news vans multiplied. Reporters circled the property like vultures, but instead of disaster, they found a story that practically wrote itself. Local ranchers' kindness repaid tenfold by grateful military. John avoided the cameras, but Sarah didn't. She stood in front of one, holding Emma's hand, her voice steady as she told the story of John's sacrifice. "He gave us everything he had," she said, her words carrying across the evening air. "Now look what's happening." And what was happening was nothing short of a miracle. The VA liaison arrived with paperwork that erased Mike's medical debt. The bank president, a stern man who had never once smiled at John, showed up in a press suit to personally assure him his mortgage would be renegotiated. Even the local feed store delivered truckloads of supplies, refusing payment. "Consider it a veteran's discount," the owner grunted before driving off. But the most surreal moment came on the third evening. The work was winding down. The fences stood straight. The barn's fresh coat of paint gleamed in the sunset, and the new irrigation system hummed quietly, pumping life back into the fields. Colonel Grant approached John, holding a small, folded American flag. "This isn't standard protocol," Grant admitted, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "But after yesterday's news segment, half the country calling you a hero." He held out the flag. "Sergeant Reynolds wanted you to have this. It flew over Camp Pendleton last month." John took it carefully, the fabric smooth under his calloused fingers. He didn't trust himself to speak. Grant cleared his throat. "There's one more thing." He signaled to a waiting soldier who hurried over with a polished wooden box. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a pair of vintage spurs, the old cavalry kind. "These belonged to my grandfather," Grant said. "He rode with the 10th Horse Cavalry back when the Army still had those. Figured they belonged here now." John ran a thumb over the engraved metal, the weight of history settling into his palm. That night, as the last trucks rumbled out of the driveway and the stars blinked to life overhead, John sat on his porch with the flag and spurs beside him. The ranch wasn't just saved, it was alive again. The scent of wet earth and fresh-cut wood filled the air, and for the first time in years, the future didn't feel like a weight on his shoulders. Down the road, a single light burned in the Reynolds trailer. Sarah had insisted on staying until Mike returned from the hospital. John had offered them the guest room, but she just smiled. "We're fine right where we are," she'd said, "but thank you." He leaned back in his chair, listening to the crickets and the distant hum of the new water pump. Somewhere out there, Mike Reynolds was getting the care he deserved. Somewhere out there, people were hearing this story and maybe, just maybe, believing in good things again. John closed his eyes. Tomorrow, he'd wake up to a ranch that could breathe again. Tomorrow, the work would begin anew. But tonight he just let himself be. The story spread faster than a prairie fire. By week's end, John's ranch had become a pilgrimage site. Cars lined the county road for miles, veterans in leather vests, families with wide-eyed children, even a busload of church ladies bearing casseroles. They came to see the place where one man's sacrifice had moved an army to action. Local news became national news. The clip of Sarah tearfully describing John's gift played on every major network, always ending with that powerful shot of soldiers rebuilding the ranch. A hashtag trended, "A new kind of hero." The White House press secretary called it a shining example of American values. John refused every interview request. At Hank's diner in town, the regulars argued over coffee. "Should have been the government helping vets all along," groused old Mr. Peterson, thumping his cane. The young waitress, Jenny, wiped tears as she refilled cups. "It's not about should've," she said softly. "It's about someone finally doing something." The high school principal organized a volunteer day. Dozens of teenagers descended on the ranch, painting fences and planting seedlings under the soldiers' supervision. Colonel Grant moved among them like a proud father, correcting hammer techniques and telling stories about Mike Reynolds' bravery overseas. The kids hung on every word. Sarah became the unexpected spokesperson. Camera shy at first, she grew steadier with each interview. "This isn't just our miracle," she told CNN, Emma perched on her lap. "It's proof that decency still matters." Behind her, the newly repaired Reynolds trailer gleamed in the sunlight, yellow ribbons tied around the porch posts. Donations poured in not just for the Reynolds family, but for veteran charities nationwide. The VA announced a new hotline for backlog cases. 3 senators introduced legislation dubbed the Rancher's Bill, streamlining benefits for wounded soldiers. John's simple act had become a political tidal wave. On Sunday morning, the little white church at the edge of town overflowed with visitors. The pastor abandoned his prepared sermon. "Today we talk about the Good Samaritan," he began, gripping the pulpit. "But what about the innkeeper, the one who took in the wounded man when the hero moved on?" His gaze found John in the back pew. "Sometimes the second act of kindness is just as holy." After services, townsfolk surrounded John, not with questions but with quiet handshakes. The bank president's wife pressed a pie into his hands. The feed store owner mumbled something about supplies on the house. Even old man Peterson nodded approval. No one mentioned his past struggles. Today, he was simply their neighbor. That afternoon, as John walked the newly irrigated fields, his phone buzzed relentlessly. Another interview request. Another charity wanting to honor him. He silenced it, watching instead as 2 soldiers taught local boys how to properly plant corn. Their laughter carried on the wind. At dusk, Colonel Grant found John by the rebuilt barn. "We ship out tomorrow," he said, leaning against the fresh pine boards. "But this isn't over." He nodded toward the road where a news van still lingered. "They'll forget in a week, but you," Grant tapped John's chest, "you started something permanent." John studied the horizon where the sun dipped below purple mountains. Somewhere out there, Mike Reynolds was learning to walk again. Somewhere, other veterans were finally getting help. And here, on this patch of earth that had nearly broken him, new life was taking root in the fields, in the town, maybe even in himself. That night, for the first time in years, John slept through until dawn. The hospital hallway smelled of antiseptic and floor wax, the fluorescent lights humming softly overhead. John hesitated outside the door, gripping the bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked from the ranch that morning. He could hear laughter inside, Mike's deep chuckle, Sarah's warm reply, Emma's giggle. For a moment he considered leaving the flowers with the nurse and slipping away. But then the door swung open, and Sarah stood there, her face lighting up. "John," she pulled him inside before he could protest. "Mike, been asking about you." The hospital bed was angled up, sunlight streaming through the window onto Mike's face. He looked different, not just healthier but lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. His leg, once stiff with untreated injury, was now wrapped in a sleek brace, the kind John had only seen on professional athletes. Doc says I'll be back on my feet in 6 weeks, Mike said, grinning as he reached out to shake John's hand. His grip was firm, his eyes clear. Thanks to you. John shifted uncomfortably. Wasn't me, it was the army, it was. It was you, Mike interrupted, his voice quiet but steady. You didn't walk away. Sarah busied herself arranging the flowers in a water pitcher, but not before John saw the shine in her eyes. Emma, perched on the edge of the bed, held up a drawing, a stick-figure version of John standing beside a soldier, a ranch house in the background, the sun a yellow scribble in the sky. That's you and Daddy, she announced. And that's your happy place. John's throat tightened. Mike reached for a folder on his bedside table. VA finally processed my paperwork, he said, flipping it open to reveal official documents stamped with approval. Full benefits, backdated. He hesitated, then added, they offered me a job, too, counseling other vets navigating the system. Sarah touched her husband's shoulder, pride glowing in her expression. We found a little house in town, she said. Close to the clinic, close to you if you'll have us. John stared at them, Mike, sitting taller than he'd ever seen him. Sarah no longer carrying the world on her back, Emma swinging her legs and humming to herself. This was what hope looked like. Not grand gestures or headlines, but this, a family putting down roots, a future taking shape. On the drive back to the ranch, John rolled down the windows, letting the warm air rush in. The fields glowed green under the afternoon sun, the irrigation system humming steadily. In the distance, the Reynolds trailer stood empty, the yellow ribbon still fluttering on the porch. That night, as John sat on his own porch, the folded flag and cavalry spurs beside him, his phone buzzed. A text from Sarah lit up the screen, a photo of Emma asleep in her new bed, Mike's hand resting on her shoulder. Underneath, 3 simple words. Come for breakfast. John smiled. Tomorrow was another day. Kindness is a seed. John Carter didn't set out to change the world. He only saw a family in need and did what he could, even when it cost him everything. But that single act grew roots no one could have predicted. It brought a community together. It gave a veteran his life back. And it reminded us all that goodness still ripples outward, even when we don't see it. So here's the question. What will your seed grow? Plant kindness, watch what happens. Subscribe for more stories.